Hello everyone and welcome to another Middle Game episode focusing on statics and dynamics with Coach B from MasterChess.com. This is the fourth video in this series, and here we're going to take a look at a game played between some of the greatest players of all time, Botvinnik versus Reshevsky in the World Championship of 1948. And so far we've seen a lot of games and we've noticed that most of the players that played an active dynamic game were able to defeat their opponent. This video, we're going to be able to see how Reshevsky, using a static advantage, was able to defeat his opponent. So let's get started. And I'm just going to fast forward to the moves and stop at the critical moments of the game. And this is the position that was reached after 14 moves. If you watch my previous video in the Statics versus Dynamics series, we've talked about this type of setup that is very common especially in the Nimzo Indian defense. Here, white claims two bishops in a huge pawn center with also kingside attacking chances, which requires a dynamic play by white. However, this position leaves a static weakness, which is the pawn on c4, and black's game should focus on targeting that pawn. Now, as a general rule in chess, you always want to make sure that you stop your opponent's plan first and then you continue with your own. Here, white is playing very aggressive and started a kingside attack with pawn to f4. Many times in this type of games, black goes after the c4 weakness right away. For example, queen to a4, attacking the c4 pawn, which is only defended by the bishop and the queen, now is being attacked by three pieces by black, so white will not be able to hold on to it. However, this gives white the opportunity to continue a kingside attack with pawn to f5. This advance gains kingside space, freezes up the e3 bishop by opening the c1 to h6 diagonal, and also gives power to the rook on f1, which was previously dead in the game. Now, if you think about it, is rushing to win the c4 pawn right away really worth it, as white is gaining so much activity? And we're going to take a look at a few variations to see why stopping the opponent's plan first and then going after a weakness is a better way to play. A possible continuation from here could be bishop takes c4, f takes e6, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, f takes e6, rook takes f8, king takes f8, knight to h5, king to g8, rook to f1. And this gives white the fierce initiative. Now white's rook, bishop, and knight are far more active than black's counterparts. A possible continuation from here could be queen to d7, bishop to g5, d5, queen to f3, knight to c7, bishop to h6 now, an excellent move where white is winning. Black can't take the bishop as the queen will get forked, and if you play something different, let's say d takes e4, after queen takes e4, rook to f8, rook takes f8, king to f8, knight takes g7, king to e7, bishop to g5, king to f8, queen takes h7, black is in a really tough spot. He can't take the knight as the queen will get pinned, and here white is totally winning as he has such a strong attack on the vulnerable king. Coming back after f4 and queen to a4 going after the c4 pawn right away. After f5, bishop takes c4 and f takes e6, we looked at the bishop capturing on d3. However, no better is bishop taking the pawn on e6. White will continue with bishop to b5, after queen to b3, pawn to d5. And now black doesn't have many great options. If he retreats the bishop to g4, after queen takes g4, queen takes b5, knight to f5, king to h8, and rook to f3, now black is in trouble as white is able to use all of his pieces in a winning kingside attack. Coming back, after d5 we looked at bishop to g4, but no better is retreating the bishop to c8. After bishop takes e8, rook takes e8, rook takes f7 is an excellent tactic. Here the king cannot take the rook on f7 because after queen to h5 white is totally winning. If the king retreats to f8, after rook to f1, king to c8 is checkmate. Coming back after queen to h5, king to f8 and rook to f1, blocking this with the bishop, it's not much better, as white can simply capture with the knight. After queen takes c3, knight takes g7 check, king to g8, knight takes e8, white is totally winning. And if black doesn't take the rook, let's say he plays something like queen takes c3, after rook to c1, queen to e5, rook c to f1, black doesn't have many options. He can try pawn to g6, but after bishop to h6, bishop to b7, queen to f3, white has a checkmate threat on f8. Even if he tries to prevent it with sacrificing his queen with queen to e7, after white captures the queen and black captures back, queen to f8, rook takes f8, and rook to f8 is still checkmate. Coming back, we looked at pawn to g6 here. Another try that black has is moving the bishop to b7 right away, as it's defended by the knight. Well, here, white can continue with knight to h5, putting pressure on the g7 pawn. After bishop to a6, here, white can play queen to f3. Even though white loses the rook on f1, after rook takes g7 check, the queen will have to sacrifice for the rook, and after white captures back, white is totally winning. Coming back, if here black moves the king to h8 instead, after queen to f7, checkmate cannot be prevented. So black will have to sacrifice the queen, and after white captures the queen, king takes g7, bishop to h6 check, king to h8, queen to f7, rook to g8, queen to f6 check, rook to g7, queen takes g7 is checkmate again. So coming back to the game, after white played the pawn to f4, here Reshevsky plays an excellent move, pawn to f5, stopping white's plan first before going after the static weakness on c4. This move now blocks white's pawn on f4, which also blocks the bishop on e3. Black's f-pawn makes sure that white's light square bishop and g3 knight will never be able to use the e4 square. And white's pieces are somewhat trapped into a cage. From here, the game continued with rook a to e1. Coming back, trying to break down the f5 pawn with pawn to d5 seems logical, but it's going to fail. As Kasparov mentioned in his analysis, after f takes e4, knight takes e4, e takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, queen to f5, pawn to c4, knight to f6. Here, after the knight captures on f6 with check and rook captures back, white no longer has doubled pawns, but c4 is still weak and white's dynamic attack is totally gone. And that's the nice thing about being on a static side, is that a static weakness is there usually for a long time, while the dynamics is like a spark. If it doesn't catch on fire to burn down the opponent's structure right away, that flare will be gone, while a static weakness will remain. So coming back to the game, Botvinnik played rook a to e1 here, and now black responded with pawn to g6, solidifying f5 and making sure that white's pieces aren't allowed to have any activity. And white responded with rook to d1. Coming back, moving the pawn to d5 will be met with knight to g7, and this will maintain the block on f5, and also it will not allow white's bishops any active diagonals. So coming back, rook to d1 was played, and now black responded with queen to f7. Queen to a4 here, going after the weakness on c4, it's also a possibility. However, Reshevsky chose queen to d7, making sure that he doesn't allow any activity for white's pieces. After this, white responded with pawn to e5. This turns f5 into a permanent rock and buries his pieces to have no activity for a long period of the game. After this, black responded with rook to c8, giving c5 support while also x-raying to the target on c4. White responded with rook f to e1, then black took on e5 and white captured back. Now all white's hopes for a dynamic compensation for the static weakness goes down the drain. He's left with inactive pieces and a miserable defensive chore. Coming back, it might have been wiser to finally give up the c4 pawn and play for some complications. For example, f takes e5, c takes d4, c takes d4, bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight takes e4, bishop to h6, knight to g7, d5, queen to d7, queen to f3, rook f to e8, d6, and now rook to c5, going after the new target, which is the pawn on e5. After queen to f4 and rook e to c8, black retains a solid advantage and should have a comfortable game. However, white has opened the game, giving him a little bit more activity as well. But coming back in the game, d takes e5 was played, Black responded with knight to g7, knight to f1, rook f to d8, bishop to f2, and now knight to h5. This move attacks the pawn on f4 and stops white from placing the dark square bishop on h4, as black's going to be able to take the pawn on f4, forking the queen and bishop. So this now forces white to move the bishop to g3 to defend that pawn. After this, black responds with queen to e8. Now that white's forces no longer pose a threat, the queen heads for a4 to finally capture the static weakness on c4. From here, the game continued with knight to e3, queen to a4, queen to a2, defending the pawn, knight takes g3, h takes g3, and now h5. Black's last two moves have permanently killed white's kingside hopes. Now all Botvinnik can do is hold on tight and hope that Reshevsky can find a decisive continuation. And I'm just going to fast forward through the moves to see how Reshevsky ended up winning this game. And here, white resigned. As you've seen in this game, it's critically important to know if the position demands static or dynamic play from you. At times, there might be a choice about which direction you'll take, but more often than not, the writing is on the wall, and there's only one correct decision. Ultimately, taking the correct path is dependent on you looking for it in the first place and a correcting reading of the imbalances. Done right, the board will usually scream quite loudly what's expected of you. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for our next video.